Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, @mail, mail.wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening.
I'm going to do a quick recap of last week's show where we talked over the importance of having a written lease agreement, and I just wanted to finish up on the terms of the lease agreement and what you need to have in that lease. So I'm going to buzz real quick over what we covered last week, and I'll spend a little bit more time on what you want to do in addition to that, as well as getting into some information for Multiflora rose control and Japanese knotweed control. So stay tuned, even if you're not interested in leasing land, and you'll get some good information for managing your pastures and areas that have been overrun with knotweed. All right, so we talked last week, you got to have a date on your lease. You need to have names and addresses of the landlord and tenant. You need a legal description of the leased property. And I did mention you don't have to be too specific, but it does need to be the legal description of the property. And you can get that simply by contacting your local assessor's office, or you should actually probably have that somewhere on property if you don't. So do look into getting a good legal description of your property. Also, time period of the lease, including the beginning and ending dates, your rental amount for a cash lease, respective shares and contributions if it's a crop share lease, when and how rent will be paid and penalties for late payments, obligations for insurance and property on the crop, and when and how the lease may be terminated, requirements for notice of termination, and also reimbursement provisions for crop nutrients and or completed field work upon termination of the lease. And the process for measuring and maintaining soil fertility and pH levels. Now, I do want to remind you that you can find this information online. This particular document I'm working from was written by Peggy Kirk Hall as the legal aspects of Ohio farmland leases, but it really carries over. There's a lot of good information in this document that carries over across state lines, which is why I've selected it for this program. Okay, so we were on reimbursement provisions for a crop still in the ground when the lease is terminated. So the land gets sold, you have a crop ready to be harvested, and they're not letting you back on the land. What can you do about it, or how is that going to be managed? That's something you need to talk about up front, simply because not do you expect them to do that to you, but because life happens and things change really fast sometimes. All right, so we also want to talk about desired or prohibited farming practices, including what types of chemicals that may or may not be used on the property. You want to discuss who is responsible for controlling the noxious weeds. So you have some kudzu creeping up, I hope not, or you have something that has escaped onto your property. You know, whose responsibility is it to take care of those weeds that are causing a problem? Also, you know, who's going to be responsible for maintaining the fences? If new fences are installed, who do they belong to? Probably the landowner because it's in the ground, but how is the tenant being compensated for the labor they're putting in for those fences? You know, whether or not the tenant can install those fences or make improvements. So, you know, talk about, you know, if I want to fix up that old building, can I, and what do I get out of it? What is my compensation for improving your value, the value of your property? Also, whether the tenant has the right to utilize any improvements made by the landlord. So if the landlord puts a new road in, is the tenant allowed to use that new road? If the landlord puts in some new fencing, it's really important to talk and work out what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And it really does seem silly when you get started, but after you finish the process of setting up a new lease agreement, going through all of these details, everyone's going to feel a lot better because you're like, oh, I was really worried about this, but now that I know my worries are covered, we're good to go, and I can farm and know my land's taken care of. So you also want to talk about the landlord's right to enter the property for specific purposes. If it's an absentee landlord and they don't live in the area, can they just show up and go hunting anytime they want in the woodlot down out in the back? Well, if you have livestock out there, you definitely don't want them hunting. Granted, I don't think you should allow your livestock in the woods, but that's a different show altogether. But you need to know when they're allowed to come in the property, and if they have to notify you they're coming on the property. Having a gate left open is a terrible thing. If you are leasing farmland from a non-farmer, someone that doesn't understand all of the intricacies of agriculture and may accidentally leave a gate open when they're visiting, then you definitely want to know that they're coming that day so that you can check all the gates when they're done. All right. Now, you also want to talk about if the landowner has a security interest in the crop, or if you don't pay them, if they're allowed to sell your crop to get their money back. What are those security interests? Also, the statement of which party will participate in federal farm programs, including responsibility for eligibility and receipt of payments. So if you are receiving payments from the federal government for crop, it does have the stipulation in there that you must personally be actively involved in the production of the crop. So if you are cash leasing your property, odds are that you will no longer be eligible for those federal payments. If you are crop sharing and you are still active in the crop production, then you can work it so that you can still receive those payments. But you need to make sure you're considering that when you're leasing your property if you're getting federal payments. And again, that's when it's useful to go to a lawyer that is familiar with agriculture and can help you work through those crazy legal loophole things. All right. Also, you want to have a procedure for resolving disputes. And hopefully you can get something where you're not going to have to, when we talked about gas leases, we talked about the arbitration clause. Do you have to work it out directly with them? Are they allowed to have a lawyer contact you and work it out for them? How are you going to work out disputes? Have that laid out in the lease program. Also, you want to make sure that you are not creating a partnership by entering into this agreement. So a partnership means that you are actually in business together. And there are partnerships and there are implied partnerships. This is a case where it's not an official partnership, it's an implied partnership. Same thing as if you and the three farmers down the road decide to take turns picking up feed in bulk and then splitting it amongst the farms. That's an implied partnership because you're working together to jointly improve your financial status. Now, if one person has an accident, they're at fault because maybe they stopped and had a beer on the way home, you and the other farmer who are also working with that one could be liable for the damages and injuries caused because of your incidental partnership. So if you are doing any type of an activity where it could be perceived that both of you are working together for a common financial goal, it needs to be written out that this is not a partnership. We're just, helping each other out. And so in this lease, you want to make sure that you state that you do not intend to create a partnership by entering into this lease agreement. Even if it's a crop share, it doesn't need to be a partnership. It still separates you. Now, sometimes maybe you've leased this property for years and you have kids, they're now grown, and they want to sublet from you, who have had this lease for 20 years, and you have a good relationship with the landlord and everything. Your kids now want to work on part of it. Do you, as the leasee, have the ability to sublet, or would they need to go to the original landowner to get a lease? Whether or not you can sublease the property should be included. Also, what could the tenant do that would constitute a default of the lease? So say someone just picks up in the middle of the night, leaves, and never comes back. Well, they had a 7-year lease. Does that mean that you as a landowner can't do anything on that property until the lease is up? What are the default agreements for those strange, crazy potentialities that no one expects? Okay, also, I know this is sounding like a lot. I promise we'll get to the field stuff, which is much more straightforward. All right, so if a change needs to be made to the lease, how would that be made? Can you just draw a line through something and initial it? Usually, but if you want it to have to be notarized or observed or witnessed or whatever, that's something that you need to indicate in the lease. And of course, you want to make sure that what are the tenant's rights if the property is transferred, sold, or condemned even during the lease period, so a longwall mine comes under it and it collapses, the property is condemned, you can no longer farm on it. What happens next? What are the tenant's rights for that particular circumstance? Also, you do want to have hold harmless and indemnification provisions, meaning that, if a tenant is farming, their tractor rolls over, that you are not personally responsible as the landowner for that tenant's tractor rolling over, and things like that. And of course, signatures of the landlord, signatures of the tenant, and preferably signatures of witnesses and a notary. All right. So we'll go ahead and stop these the lease information and all this legal stuff, and we'll talk a little about something that is just as thorny but easier to deal with, and that is Multiflora rose. If you're looking at August, you've decreased the effectiveness of your foliar sprays, but they can still be used. So your glyphosate, your imazapirs, and your methylsulfamure, I can never say this one, your Cimarron and your Escort, all those in a foliar spray are effective on Multiflora rose at this time of year. In fact, August, not too terrible of a time to use those specific chemicals. The plants are in the process of storing up some sugars. They're getting ready to go into that transition stage. So anytime between August and September, you want to get out there and get a good foliar spray with your glyphosates, your imazapirs, or your metsulfuron methyl, or your Cimarron, your Escort, your Arsenal, your Roundup, Touchdown, Glyphamax. So you also do want to make sure, though, if you are spraying in a pasture field, that chemical is labeled for use in pastures, and that you know what the withdrawal date is. How long do you have to keep the animals out before they can go in and graze in this pasture field, and what are the residual effects? And also, how long do you have to hold the animals before you sell them after being in a field with some of these chemicals? So you do have to read the labels. Read the label, read the label, read the label. I don't know how many times I have to say that, but it's really important. All right, so you always want to make sure you're using a clean water source. And as long as if you are worried about nearby plants, like say there's some trees nearby, you want to make sure that you are protecting the foliage. Your glyphosate is not going to move as much as, say, your imazapyr, where you have to prevent nearby plants from drift and runoff. And as for your Cimarron, your Escort, you do need to include a non-ionic surfactant, 0.25% or 1 quart per 100 gallons for the foliar spray mix. And this is more slow acting, so you're not going to see something happen right overnight. And for your glyphosate mixes, you're looking at 1% in water. And for your imazapyr, you're looking at 0.5% in water. And for your methylsulfuron methyl, you're looking at 1 ounce per 100 gallons of water. All right. And if you have more questions about the exact mixes, I would be happy to help you with that. But you do want to make sure that you get a good coverage on the leaves, and you should have good results for controlling Multiflora rose. Now, it's also a good time of year to start controlling Japanese knotweed. Hopefully at some point throughout this summer and spring, you mowed down the knotweed so it's not towering over your head. But even if you didn't, this can still be effective. Now, keep in mind when you're looking at knotweed, this is not a 1-year process. You are going to have to treat more than once. You're going to have to watch how you treat and make sure you're doing it at the right times of year. Now, you can use a lot of the same pesticides or herbicides that I mentioned before. You just have to make sure, because knotweed prefers to grow near wet areas, if there is running water, you need to or a pond, you need to make sure that the herbicide you are using is qualified and properly formulated to be used near water. So regular old Roundup you cannot use near water because it does not break down in water, and it'll float on the water and it'll go really, really far and cause some damage. You would use its counterpart Rodeo, which is formulated for use around water. So again, it's going to state on the label, remember we're always reading the labels, that it is formulated for use on or near water. That's really important. So we're looking at for August and September, you can use triclopyr, you can use picloram, you can use 2,4-D-amine. Those can be used throughout this growing season. We do recommend that when they are in flower, that's not a good time to treat them because the bees absolutely love them. And of course, glyphosate from July to September is really good for treating knotweed. Now, ideally, when you're trying to get rid of knotweed, you're going to mow it or cut it maybe mid-June. And basically, that step is just so that it's not so thick and allows you to get better coverage when you spray it later in the summer. So if you were to spray knotweed, say in the spring or early summer, it's going to look a little nasty, but it's not going to hurt it at all. You really do need to wait until these later months of summer. End of July, August, September is your ideal time to start spraying knotweed to get rid of it. Now, here's the tricky part. It's very important that if you are cutting knotweed, that you don't just pile it somewhere or throw it in a ditch, because the knotweed that you cut can create a whole new plant. At every node, which is where a leaf comes out, that little ridge, that node can create an entire new plant. So even if you're grinding it up, say you're tilling it, tilling is actually the worst thing you can do for knotweed control, because for every little piece you break off, as long as it's about the size of your thumbnail, a root can create a whole new plant. So by tilling the roots of knotweed, you are actually worsening your problem. So do not till an area that is full of knotweed. You really want to use a chemical control or just call that land off limits for the next 3 years, because it's going to be covered in heavy layers of carpet. So that's really the only organic control for knotweed, is to mow it and smother it. And the tricky part with that is, with knotweed, it is also a trickster. So it could look like it's dead. It could not come up next year. So you start taking away what you're using to control that. Like, say you pull the carpet off, you don't see any new seedlings coming up. And you're like, okay, I'm great. And so you go ahead and till. Well, then it's going to say, oh, this is a great place to grow. And all of those roots you tilled up could come back and take over the area with a vengeance. So unfortunately, I know that I'm not a huge proponent of chemical use. This is one plant I will always recommend using a chemical on, because it is very difficult to control from an organic standpoint. So you can cover it with a thick layer of old carpeting and just keep it smothered and let it grow up, smother it again, let it grow up, smother it again. So basically you're completely depleting the root system of any sugars and starches that it can use to grow. That is how you're going to get rid of it. You really need to be vigilant and nonstop hardcore on it. If you're using a chemical application, you still need to be vigilant and nonstop about treating it. It's just a little bit more, it's more reliably effective. And so you mow it down midsummer and let it grow back up so that it has to use up those extra root reserves. And then you spray it about this time of year in the fall time before leaf drop, though, before the leaves start changing. It's a key. Once the leaves start changing, it's no longer taking anything into the roots. It's all right, I've got all I need for the winter. I'm just going to shut down now. Now, I got distracted from a little bit of something I said earlier that I did want to go back to, and that is, what do you do with the plants that you are discarding? That you've cut them, you have a giant pile of knotweed, what do you do? Well, you can burn it. Let it dry for a little bit and burn it. You can put it in plastic bags and lay them in the sun for 3 days. That will make sure that the plant is no longer viable and that it can't spread somewhere else. You never want to put knotweed in a compost bin or a compost pile because it will just create a knotweed mountain. So you definitely don't want to try to compost this stuff unless you have given it a hearty 3 days in full sun in a garbage bag that's been sealed shut. So basically you're baking it to kill it. And that is what you need to do to make sure those plants can't go ahead and spread somewhere else. If you are working alongside a waterway, you do have to be careful because while the knotweed is not a great bank preserver, it is doing something. So when you take the knotweed out, you need to put something else in, or the knotweed is just going to come right back. It's going to float. The seeds are going to float downstream from your neighbor's property or your neighbor's property, or the birds are going to bring some in for you because they're nice like that. You want to make sure that you're putting something back on that bank that you really want there. And bank stabilization is a really challenging issue, especially with these heavy rain showers that we've gotten. We've really seen a lot of bank movement. And if you are worried about your bank and you are trying to deal with the knotweed because it's encroaching into your pasture fields and your gardens, and you want to get this invasive species off your property, do make sure you have a plan in place as to what you are going to put back on that bank. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that today, but I will cover it next week. But right now, we just want to make sure that when you're working with knotweed, that you are not just going in and ripping it out of the soil, because honestly, if you're just going in and pulling it out, you are leaving behind a very viable root system. So those roots will come back. And if you are trying to spray something multiple times through a summer, it will go dormant and it will hide. And then when you stop spraying, it will come back. So keep in mind that, your glyphosate is also going to affect other plants that have green leaves that are around it. So your grasses will be affected. But the good thing about glyphosate, it is not persistent in the soil. So once you've taken care of this, you don't have to have a waiting period. Your 2,4-D-amine, it's better earlier in the season, but it does have a persistency of up to a month. So it's going to keep working to help deal with the new sprouts that come up. Your triclopyr, you're looking at treatment season of May through October. Again, it's going to have a persistency in the soil of up to 6 weeks, so keep that in mind when using it. And your picloram, you can do a soil treatment with picloram in the winter, but keep in mind that it is going to be persistent in the soil for 2 years, and that's a broadleaf herbicide. So if you are trying to grow something to follow up your knotweed, picloram is not the one that you want to use. Again, make sure that you are reading the label and that it is formulated to use near water. Another thing to keep in mind is if you are a builder or having something built on your property where you are moving soil from off your property to on your property, you do want to make sure that that soil is not coming from someplace that has been infested with knotweed. That's a really easy way for it to just pick up and hitchhike to a whole new location. So you do want to make sure you're asking about that. Does this soil have a bunch of knotweed roots in it? And am I going to be fighting with this for the rest of my life? You can use a root barrier membrane, but they can be damaged by burrowing mammals. So the root barrier membrane can prevent knotweed from penetrating a drainage system. But it is difficult because you're looking at a plant that will push up concrete. Knotweed is some pretty crazy stuff. So once you see one plant of it on your property, you really want to take proactive measures to make sure that you are preventing that knotweed from becoming established. If you are trying to restore a trailway or a stream bank, like I said before, you want to start with the areas where you still have some of the native plant material. Remove a little bit of the knotweed at a time so that the native plant material has a chance to fill in that vacant space. Replanting plants that you like is great, but really you want to make sure that you are just not leaving bare soil, because bare soil requires a Band-Aid. It's like having an open wound on your skin, and if there is bare soil, nature will put a Band-Aid on it, and usually the Band-Aid is not what you want growing there. Knotweed will come right back in. So when you're trying to restore an area that's been infested with knotweed, start small, take your time, and don't get discouraged, because it's going to be a long, probably forever process, just something you do a little bit at a time. But there is hope for that. And in Europe, there is a whole manual of how to deal with knotweed, because it is considered a noxious weed. And so they have a huge code of practice even on how to manage knotweed on development sites to protect them from expanding it.
COVID-19 vaccination protects you and those around you. When communities are vaccinated, fewer people get sick. Community immunity begins with each one of us. Visit vaccinate.wv.gov to learn more about COVID-19 vaccination. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.